Hey, this is Tom Webster, and this is Sounds Profitable for Tuesday, May 9th, 2023. Podcasting's Golden Ratio. The Edison Research Share of Ear data shows that podcasting's share of daily audio listening for Americans 13 plus has doubled over the last 9 years. This week, I'm going to highlight a related stat that shows a promising ratio for podcasting's core. But first, this week on the Product Deep Dive, Angelica Podez of MediaStream walks Bryan Barletta through the MediaStream streaming platform. With over 16 years of experience creating streaming solutions for companies, MediaStream enables companies to manage, distribute, host, and grow their audiences from one location. Check out the link in the description or tune in at soundsprofitable.com. Well, hello, Captain Obvious here. I wanted to point out something in the latest share of ear data from Edison Research that, well, frankly, is staring us all in the face, but we need to talk about nonetheless. Edison's Insights newsletter last week gave us a little bit of good news about podcasting's share of total audio time in the U.S. Since 2014, back when Share of Ear began tracking all forms of audio, I worked on the project back then, the percentage of total audio time that Americans 13 plus spend with podcasting has more than quadrupled from 2% of total audio time to 9%. Now, over that time, the number of hours per day that we spend listening to audio has remained the same, really, about 4 hours per day. So those gains are real gains in what has been a zero-sum battle for our earballs. To math this up a little bit, that means that the average American now spends about 22 minutes a day listening to podcasts. Now, you might be tempted to see patterns in this number, like the well-worn but frankly not correct trope of the 22-minute commute. But no, 22 minutes does not, as we say in stats, reflect the central tendency of this data. The share of ear data is an average of all Americans, the majority of which do not listen to podcasts every day. So that 22-minute average is the product of a lot of zeros getting averaged in with some much, much higher numbers. Now, in 2014, that figure again was 2%, or about 5 minutes a day spread across all Americans. So in proportion to the share, the number of minutes per day that we spend on podcast listening as a country has also quadrupled. Now, 4 times seems like a pretty good result, but how can we equate that to the health of podcasting? Could it be higher? Should it be higher? Well, the answer is in a simple ratio that's right there in plain sight. The relationship between the growth in time spent listening to podcasts and the growth in listeners. And for this, we turn to another Edison study, the Infinite Dial 2023 from Edison, Wondery, and ART19. According to the latest podcast listening data from that report, the current percentage of Americans 12 plus who listen weekly is now 31%. Now, in 2014, when Share of Ear started tracking cross-audio usage, that figure was 8%. My trusty Commodore 64 VisiCalc tells me that 31 divided by 8 is about 4, rounding up for dramatic effect. That means that weekly listeners over the same period of time tracked by Share of Ear have also quadrupled. So the time spent listening to podcasts has quadrupled, and the number of listeners has at least quadrupled. Now, averages are never simple. The people who have recently discovered podcasts are unlikely to be spending as much time with the medium as the people who've been listening for 10 years or more. What is more likely to be the case is that new listeners come aboard with a low figure for daily listening, maybe a few minutes, while longer tenured listeners continue to add hours to their already robust consumption. But the fact that the 4 times ratio for listener growth matches the 4 times growth for total share of audio and minutes spent is a very good thing. It means that we haven't yet exhausted our core. Let me unpack that a bit, as it's a bit dense. As long as the ratios between listener growth and actual time growth are similar, this means that podcasting is still on an upward trajectory. Either new listeners are listening a ton, or core listeners are listening even more than they used to, or both. Now, in practice, we know that the newer you are to podcasting, the less time you spend per day listening to podcasts. So the fact that listener growth is not diluting the growth in share of time means that people who've been with the medium for a while are still adding new time every day to listen to podcasts. Now, here's the alternate scenario. Listener growth quadruples, but share of time merely doubles or triples. This could be a clue that the medium is perhaps beginning to mature. Listening by core listeners remains unchanged, while newer, more casual listeners dilute the average time metrics. These newer listeners may or may not mature into the kind of heavy listeners that the core are, but in any case, any medium has its share of core, secondary, and tertiary listeners. A change in that ratio between listeners and time could be a signal that core usage is slowing, and listener behavior is such that we are adding more light usage than heavy usage. But the Edison data shows this is not yet happening. This leads me to something we should all be thinking about: cross-promotion. I think many of us are used to a world in which when one podcast ends, the default behavior is to find a new podcast to listen to. That's core listener behavior, the people who are fans of podcasting. But as we bring more and more secondary and tertiary listeners to podcasting, we can't assume that that's their default behavior, because they didn't come for podcasting. They came for a show, and when that show is over, we can't assume they're going to look for another. Now, today we see cross-promoting a related podcast as the received wisdom for best practices. And that's not necessarily wrong. But if that one podcast promo doesn't grab the casual listener, they may very likely be back on TikTok and not Pocket Casts. So for some big tent podcasts, we might consider promoting not an individual podcast, but podcasting in general, the wonderful universe of content that is almost entirely freely available and easy to consume with apps you already use. Earlier this year, I was locked in a month of jury duty for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and I recall having conversations about podcasting with my fellow jurors. More than one said, "I don't really listen to podcasts," followed by a podcast that they actually do listen to. This is a curious thing to say, perhaps, for those of us who listen to hours of podcasts every day. But this is the gap we need to try to close. The gap between someone who listens to a podcast and someone who says, when asked, that, yeah, they listen to podcasts. I mentioned last week about the fact that podcasting has never really promoted its more utilitarian benefits, like convenience and time shifting, at any scale to mainstream Americans. And I think this plays into that notion. For now, though, adding new listeners is not diluting or reducing the growth in average time spent listening to podcasts. And that's a ratio I'll continue to watch as we wind our way into podcasting's teenage years. One thing is for certain, though. It's easier to convince someone who listens to one podcast to listen to two than it is to convince a non-listener to try their first. Thanks again for listening to Podcasting's Golden Ratio. This episode was built using Spooler and hosted on ART19. I'm Tom Webster. We'll see you next week.